Hello all, this is Professor McCoy again with another online video lesson. So during the same post-World War II period in which structural functionalism became quite popular, there was also a sharply opposing school of thought. That was the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. And so rather than being influenced by the classical theory of Emil Durkheim, the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School were influenced by another well-known famous theorist, that of Karl Marx. And so they have a very different approach than structural functionalism. So whereas structural functionalism wants to try to understand how the different parts of society work together to produce overall stability, critical theorists really want to understand, why is it that some groups of people in society have more power and more resources than others, and how is it possible that an unjust and kind of unequal economic system of capitalism is able to maintain itself, right? So they're really approaching it, as Marxists being very critical, of capitalism, and they're trying to understand, how capitalism could keep on going since it's, has all these problems that Marx talked about. And so, they are basically, later day Marxists, right? 20th century Marxists. And so 20th century Marxists have a certain problem. What's the problem? There was no communist revolution, right? Not in the West anyway, right? So what they, when Marx was alive during the middle of the 19th century, he really thought that the communist revolution was going to come in his lifetime. He thought it was going to come in the next, 10, 15, 20 years. He thought that conditions were so terrible and so unjust that, from the reasons we talked about, that the masses were going to rise up, the system would fall apart, and then you would kind of enter this final stage of communism. So that did not happen, right? That did not happen in Western Europe. It did not happen in America. It did not happen. It happened, there was a communist revolution in Russia in 1917, but for most of the Marxists and the critical theorists, they really did not think of that as what they envisaged as a communist revolution. They were horrified by what happened, and particularly the tactics of Stalin and what happened during, after World War II. And so that communist revolution in Russia was not what they hoped for, not what they imagined. And so really what they have to deal with is, why did the communist revolution not happen as they predicted in the West, like in Europe and in America? And how can we understand, and how can we keep a kind of a Marxist theory going if that did not happen? And so these later Marxists really have to explain, right, why there was no revolution. So this is, at heart, some of the problems, some of the issues that the Frankfurt School is doing, right? The critical theorists in the Frankfurt School. So why that name and where are they coming from? So probably not surprisingly, they're coming from Frankfurt, right? Frankfurt, Germany. There was an institute there called the Institute for Social Research that was set up by Max Horkheimer. And basically what he did is he collected a number of scholars, pretty smart people around him, thinkers, who were all kind of influenced by the similar people, right? So all kind of left-leaning, left-wing kind of thinkers. So influenced by Marx, but also influenced by other people such as Freud, so kind of interested in psychoanalysis, also influenced by Weber, right? But very much kind of a left-wing kind of, school of thought. However, even though they were influenced by Marx, they took a pretty significant departure from his traditional theory. So for Marx, and for some people who came right after Marx, like his friend, Friedrich Engels, the most important thing was the economy, right? The economy is the base, and the economy, determines all other parts of society, right? If you want to understand society, if you want to understand, revolution, you have to understand the economy, right? That's the driving force of society and the driving force of history. what these critical theorists say is, okay, that's maybe where we went wrong, right? Maybe it's not, maybe the economy isn't everything. Maybe that there's other things that matter. And so these critical theorists began to think about other things like, culture, about ideology, what people thought, what were things other than the economy going on that helped keep capitalism going. So that's the first thing. They made a kind of an adjustment to Marxism. Less of a focus on an economy, more of a focus on culture and ideas and other things that are in the superstructure. What are they also against? So they're also against what is called positivism, or what they call positivism. So what is positivism? So positivism is basically a view in which social science is supposed to be conducted like a natural science. Most importantly, it's supposed to be objective, right? That the goal of social scientists is to kind of accurately describe what the social world is like. So just like an astronomer might describe the planets, a physicist describe physical forces, social science is supposed to be very scientific, very objective, and simply describe what the social world is like and come up with theories about why it is that way. So in their mind, the prime example of a positivist or positivism theory is, structural functionalism, right? To explain, the functioning of the social world through, these different processes and how, AGIL and all this stuff, right? But simply to describe it in an objective, scientific way. Critical theorists said, hey, that's not actually the purpose of social science, not the purpose of sociology. Critical theory says, look, the goal of social thought is not simply to describe the way the world is now, but to offer an alternative vision of society. Right? So one of the key words they use is transcendence. Right? That what they want from society, or what they want to give society, is to show how society could be different. Right? How can we transcend or move past our current circumstances into a new world or a new social structure, right? And so they want to give people a vision of what the world could be, not just describe what the world is right now. So how do you do that? So as the name implies, the first thing you do with critical theory is you criticize, right? That the job of critical theory is not just to describe, but to be critical, to criticize the current structure of society and say, hey, here are the problems, here's what's wrong, here's how it could be better, right? And so critical theorists are really opposed to this positive view of social science, and they really think of that's just serving the goals of the status quo, right? That if you just describe how things function, you're part of the problem. And they want to say, hey, we want to get past this sort of society and get to a better one. And so they really, if you look at the handout here, they're really taking on this idea from Marx, right? So as you're all know, remember, you really should be having your handout in front of you as you're watching this video. It will really help you follow along. Okay, so as we see, to take this from Marx, so one of Marx's most famous quotes is, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it, right? And the critical theorists really take this to heart. They say, look, our job is not to describe what society is like or to interpret it, but to say, to change it, to create a better society. And so Horkheimer, the person who really created critical theory, founded the school in Frankfurt, said, in a very similar way, critical theory seeks to liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them, right? So the goal here is really freedom and liberty, to break out of the current social structure and get into a new, better society, right? And so in this way, they are, they do have this more, maybe not quite utopian, but more kind of idealistic approach. However, also in this way, they kind of slightly depart from Marx. So Marx was very much a utopian, right? He was very much focused on, you know, this idea that eventually the world was going to end up in this communist utopia, and eventually things were all going to be good. The critical theorists are not so positive, right? They're not so optimistic, right? So it's good to know that really the critical theorist is made up of a series of German Jewish scholars who had just experienced the Holocaust, right? And so their view of the possibility of, an idealistic utopian society is they're, from what they had experienced, they're not so positive. And so again, this is part of the name of the school. Their goal is not to offer a utopia. Their goal is to criticize and critique the current society. In this way, though, they really hope to provide liberty, right? That the end goal is to provide a better future for people, right? To break people out of their current society by offering them a vision of a new world. Okay, so this is a theory, critical theory, very much in the abstract. Now what we could do is kind of focus a little bit more on some of the particular aspects of it. So I'm going to talk about three general kind of specific things. So first I'm going to talk about the concept of the culture industry. Second, I'm going to talk about your reading by Marcuse, The One-Dimensional Man. And then thirdly, lastly, I'm going to lightly touch on the work of Habermas, also one of your readings, and a contemporary critical theorist who is still alive. Okay, so let's talk firstly about the concept of the culture industry that the critical theorists created and prophesied. So if we remember, these 20th century Marxists have to try to explain, right, why there was no revolution, what stopped the communist revolution from happening. And so to try to understand that, they go back to the Marxist concept of ideology. So what is ideology? So what is ideology? So if you remember from Marx, ideology is this form of control or domination. It is how the upper classes or dominant class uses their control over ideas and beliefs, these kind of mental structures to control the masses of people and to get them to think and believe in a way that benefits them and keeps up the status quo. And so the critical theorists really take on this idea of ideology or ideological domination and run with it. They say, okay, this explains why there was not a communist revolution in the West, right? That basically there is such a degree of ideological control that even though the economic system is unjust and even though there are all these contradictions within capitalism, the dominant class is able to keep it going through their degree of ideological control, right? And in particular, they really focus on popular culture as a form of control. So going to the movies, the radio, popular music. And so they see here two things that popular culture does. So the first thing is it distracts people. It puts people to sleep is basically what they say. So it distracts them from what is important, what are the problems of society, and fills up their heads and their time with entertainment, right? The latest movie star getting divorced, the latest music, basically kind of really just, puts them to sleep and makes people think, oh, everything's okay, and not to worry about what's really going on, but just to worry about these Hollywood stars in their lives. So that's the first thing. It distracts people and kind of puts them to sleep. Kind of, a celebrity culture might be an example of this. The second thing it does is creates what Engels called a false consciousness, right? So a false consciousness, if you remember, is a belief system or a way of thinking that the dominated class, the lower classes have, that is given to them by the upper classes. It's not their real consciousness. It's not what they really think about the world, but it's a false representation of the world that is given to them through the mass media to make them think that the world is different than what it actually is, right? It makes them believe that, everything's okay when things really are not okay, right? So in this way, they really focus on culture, right? The cultural elements of society, and say, look, that's what's going on. It's not the economy, it's not the control over our economy that allows the dominant classes to keep their position. It's their control over the culture system that allows them to maintain the status quo and keep capitalism going. That's what's stopping the revolution. So let's dig a little bit more deeper into this. So Horkheimer and Adorno, right? So we have Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, so kind of the two big stars of the Frankfurt School. They come up with this concept of what they call the culture industry. So that term is also very important. So to notice, they don't call it a popular culture. They don't call it a mass culture. They don't call it a folk culture. They call it a culture industry, right? And so why are they doing that? And so what they're doing is they're really trying to say, look, it's not a popular culture in a sense that it's not a popular culture, and it's not a mass culture in a sense that the masses created it, or that it's actually popular in terms of it rose up from popular beliefs. No, it's a culture industry, meaning that these ideas, these cultural products like a movie or a TV show or a comic book or a magazine, a pop song, got created as a product. And so what's the point of a product in capitalism, right? The point of a product is to make a profit, right? That is the end goal, right? To produce something that people will buy, and that you produce it, you sell it for more than what it costs you to make it, right? That you, at the end of the day, a TV show, a radio show, a comic book, a novel, they're all just like a commodity, just like a carton of milk or a t-shirt. They're there to be produced for profit within a capitalist system. And so that's the first thing they really want to highlight. They want to say, look, all this stuff that we see around here, in our culture, we have to remember that they are products. We are being sold them, and somebody is producing them to make a profit, right? And so they say, look, we want to call it the culture industry to highlight this fact, right? To show it. The old joke is, it's called show business, not show, art or show fun, right? It's show business. It is an industry. It is there to make money. And this is obvious, right? We know this, but often we don't think about it, right? We don't understand, well, what effect does that have? And so what Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer want to say is, well, okay, this is really going to have three important effects on what these cultural products, these cultural commodities, what do they look like? It's going to affect them in three ways, and in three negative ways. And so what they're trying to do is show people this problem, to criticize it, and so that people will wake up out of their sleep and realize, hey, there's something wrong here. So what's the three problems? So the first problem is what they call homogenization, right? Homogenization with the illusion of choice, right? So what they say is that within the culture industry of 20th century West, including Western Europe and America, everything is all the same, right? All the products have become copies of one another, right? Why are they copies of one another? Because they are mass produced. So just like you mass produce cars and their cars are all pretty much the same, just like you mass produce t-shirts and the t-shirts all, very similar, you mass produce culture. And so the cultural products all come to resemble one another, right? So you have pop songs that are, 3 to 4 minutes long. You have boy bands that are basically copies of one another, right? NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, One Direction, and then next year there'll be another boy band that will be a copy of all the others, right? Or you even can think about it in terms of something more everyday, right? Think about going to a coffee shop, right? Has anybody here ever been to a Starbucks, for example? If you walk into one Starbucks, you've walked into every Starbucks in the world, right? Every Starbucks is a copy of every other Starbucks, right? The whole idea of chain restaurants or chain stores, right? You go into one TGIF Fridays, you've gone into all of them, right? They're all copies of one another, right? And that is part of our culture now, right? We have chain stores, we have Starbucks, but also it's our music, it's our movies, it's our magazines, right? You know, that they all become copies, they all become very stale and the same. It's all very formulaic, is what we can say, right? So think about the classic formula of, say, a horror movie or an action movie, you know, that they basically follow the same stale old formula again and again and again, right? That all the movies become copies of one another. The problem here, so that's a problem, but the bigger problem they say is, well, that along with that is there's an illusion of choice, right? You know, we're not being told that they're all copies. We are being fed this story that actually that they're all different, right? We are marketed to in such a way as to give this false impression that there are all these options in front of us and that we can choose amongst this range of things, right? Oh, you can go have this or that, and you know, you have all the choices. You're a free consumer. But what the critical theorists are going to say is really it's a false choice because you're choosing amongst a number of products that are all just the same, right? You can go to this chain restaurant or you can go to another chain restaurant, right? You can go to TGI Fridays or go to some other chain restaurant, right? But basically your choices are really, even those chain restaurants are the same, right? And so you think you can choose, but really you're just choosing among a number of products that are simply all the same, right? So that's the first problem, right? Creates homogenization with an illusion that you can actually choose something. Second problem, the culture industry is static, right? And these two problems kind of really go together. By static, what I mean is it's unchanging. It's the same product year after year after year. Right? We can see this in terms of the boy bands, right? That it's Backstreet, New Kids on the Block, and it's Backstreet Boys, and it's NSYNC, and it's One Direction, right? It's really the same band, every 4 or 5 years gets kind of resurrected with different people in it, but really sounding very similar and just the same again and again. We see this in the classic example of movie sequels, right? Think about Spider-Man, right? We had 3 Spider-Man movies, right? The original Spider-Man series. And then, that went away. And then right away, then you had 2 more Spider-Man movies, right? The Amazing Spider-Man. Oh, that went away. Oh, we get 2 more Spider-Man movies, right? That it's really, we keep getting the same movie literally again and again and again, right? And so we get, or think of other sequels and reboots and franchises like, oh, it's a Marvel movie, it's a comic book movie, it's this comic book movie. There's no change. And so the culture industry doesn't want it to change. It's just keep producing the same thing again and again and again over and over. So for Adorno in particular, he's really frustrated by this aspect of the culture industry. For him, culture is supposed to be what's called avant-garde. Avant-garde means pushing into the future, right? That real art, real culture is something that pushes the boundaries, makes us think of the world in a different way, makes us, kind of makes us question or makes us doubt. That art is something that you see and you're like, oh, that's really surprising. I never saw that before. But what he sees in the culture industry is that never happens. What they want is safety. They want the consumer to feel comfortable and to feel satisfied that you bought a ticket to a movie expecting to see something and you got what you expected, right? That you got what you paid for because you know that it's a product. And so he's really offended by this because he says this really goes against this idea of art. Art and culture, is really supposed to be something that pushes the boundaries and makes us think of the world in a different way. But the culture industry does exactly the opposite and just makes us comfortable and satisfied and just think the same way time and time and time again. it satisfies us, right? And so this is very obviously supportive of the status quo, right? Don't offend people, don't push the boundaries, just keep making the same thing again and again. Third, so that's the first two problems, right? What's the third problem? The third problem is that the culture industry is very passive, right? It's a very passive form of consumption, right? And so part of this is the products, right? That the products have become very, very formulaic. So, you watch a rom-com or romantic comedy, you know what you're gonna get. And so you don't really have to put too much thought into it. You watch a TV show that's about 30 minutes long and there's gonna be some problem, there's gonna be some jokes. But by the end of that 30 minutes, everything's gonna be resolved. And then you can watch the same show again, right? You can binge watch it. You can watch, season after season of something, Parks and Rec or The Office, and pretty much what you're going to get each episode, right? And you're satisfied at the end of it. You're entertained, right? But it's very passive, right? You don't have to put that much thought into it. It doesn't confront you. It doesn't make you really think that much. This is what they argue. Part of it is the medium, right? That TV shows and movies, they're very passive. You sit down in a chair, you watch a screen, and you don't do anything, right? You're not asked to physically move. You're not asked to engage, right? It's not like playing a board game. It's not like going out for a walk. It's not like, it's not, you just sit there and consume, passively watch the screen in front of you, and you're satisfied. And so this is making a very passive form of consumption. Again, it's passive form of consumption with an illusion of control, right? That you think that you're in control, that you're not passive, you're active, you get to choose. But what's happening is you're just sitting back and kind of passively receiving this entertainment. Right? So it says for this thing, you're really kind of creating a culture that's really not very good, right? That is very stale, right? The same thing again and again, even with this illusion of newness. It's all the same with an illusion of choice, and it's all passive with illusion of control. Here's an important thing, though, to end with. What they argue is that these cultural products are not just creating, it's not just a problem with the cultural products themselves, but it creates a problem with the people consuming them. That what happens is as people consume these homogenized, unchanging, passive products, they themselves become passive, homogenized, unchanging types of people, right? That eventually, years and years of being part of this culture industry puts you to sleep, right? Makes you passive, makes you unthinking, right? That it creates types of people that are very easy to control. And so they really push this very far, and they say, look, the culture industry is really a form of propaganda, right? It's getting people to think in a certain way and getting people to be passive, kind of like sheep, right? Getting people just to kind of accept and move on with their lives. And so in this way, they say the culture industry is a form of ideological control, right? That Netflix and the movies you watch and the TV shows and the music that you listen to is not just fun, it's not just entertainment, but it's a form of domination, right? That it's controlling your life and turning you into a passive person. So, they really are very critical, right? And they're telling people this in order to wake them up, right? To criticize present society and say, hey, maybe this is a problem. Maybe we could have a different society with a truly free culture, not a culture industry. All right, so that's the first thing, the culture industry. Now we can move on to the second, right? Which is your reading, pretty much. It's by Herbert Marcuse, The One-Dimensional Man. And so Herbert Marcuse was, again, he was a German scholar. He was in Frankfurt, during the World Wars. He was Jewish and so moved, to America. He ended up in New York City, and he resided in what was called the New School New York City, and he really became, an eminent scholar in the U.S., and he actually stayed in America for the rest of his life. And during the 1960s, he wrote this book called The One-Dimensional Man. It became incredibly popular, actually. It was read by the radicals of the 1960s, and really became part of that kind of 1960s kind of movement. So let me kind of give you kind of a summary of what the book is about and talk a little bit about what your reading focuses on. Okay, so what does the title mean, right? This idea of a one-dimensional man. So he's really saying this in some sense is that, this is about homogenization. This is about creating a type of person that is very single or one-dimensional, very kind of plain and boring, and very passive, right? Narrowing the field of possibilities and just making a person very kind of simple and very kind of one way, right? And so what he is saying basically is that within capitalism, you don't have totalitarianism, right? A control of the state, directly controlling people and saying, oh, you must do this, you must think this. But the economic system of capitalism is able to do that on its own, right? It's able to create people who are kind of very one-dimensional thinkers, right? And so in a way, he also talks about this is that what one-dimensional thinking does is it conceals the contradictions of capitalism, right? It makes people, contradiction is you have to kind of think two things at once, like, oh, it's this way, but it's also this way. But you can't do that in one-dimensional thinking. In one-dimensional thinking, you can only think, oh, it's just this one way. And so what happens is, okay, capitalism has some contradictions in it, is what Marcuse will say, right? So what's an example of a contradiction he talks about? Okay, let's think about America. America is the wealthiest country in the world, probably the wealthiest country in the history of the world, right? It's incredibly wealthy. But America is also a country with an incredible amount of poverty, right? That we have people on food stamps, that we have a good percentage of the population below the poverty line, right? That, if children are out of school, that's a problem because they're not getting food to eat, right? So you have an incredibly wealthy country that also has a significant degree of poverty. And so Marcuse would say, oh, this is a contradiction, right? How can you have incredible wealth, but also have a large amount of poverty? And so what he's saying was that's an obvious problem with capitalism. It's a contradiction. What one-dimensional thought does is conceal that. It says, okay, that's not really a problem. That's not really that's not really a thing. Don't worry about it. It comes up with theories like trickle-down economics. Well, if the wealthy people have more wealth, then they're going to share their wealth downwards, and then the people downwards will get more wealth, and then it will, everybody will become wealthy, right? So it kind of conceals or hides that contradiction and just allows people to think, oh, well, it's just this one way, right? And so this idea of one-dimensional thought is creating a passive person, right? A person that is not able to critically think about their world, not able to think on their own, but is really kind of accepting of society's views and accepting of this ideological control that is around them, right? It really says, it goes through this list of how this is achieved. It makes people think that they are freer than what they actually are, right? You're free to buy this brand of toothpaste or this brand of coffee, but you're not really free to really, create the world or your life the way you want. It's a creation of consumer goods. This is a lot of what you're reading about, that people are free to buy and free to consume the products they want, and that this very limited form of freedom makes people think that they are actually freer than they are, and that this pacifies them. People, are made to have a very limited form of political discourse, right? Democrat versus Republican would be a good example, right? That, those are the only two options and you got to choose one or the other, right? And that's a very kind of narrow limited, one-dimensional way of viewing politics, and that everything is just very kind of, plodding forth and very kind of singular dimensional. Right? No kind of alternatives are allowed to be imagined. Right? You can't have an alternative society imagined. You can't have an alternative economic system. You can't have an alternative culture. Right? It all has to be this only one way of doing things. And so he says, totalitarianism doesn't just exist in state-controlled, government-controlled systems. That capitalism can, without state control, produce a form of totalitarianism that controls people. In your reading, he talks specifically about this idea of false needs versus true needs. And this really goes back to this idea of false consciousness. Okay? But now we're talking a little bit more about consumerism. So he really sees that the problem with society is consumerism, right? Buying goods, the products that we buy. So what is a false need? So a false need is something that you desire, but really is a desire that is put into you by the culture industry, right? That desire is not something that comes within inside of you. It's not an honest or true desire of what you want, but is a false or fake desire that got put into you by, say, marketing, right? So for example, your desire to have a certain brand of clothing, your desire to own a car, your desire to watch a TV show or to identify with a certain style of music. What Marcuse would say is, well, that's all really a fake or false need. That's not really what you wanted. That's not really who you are, but that's a false you and a false desire that got put into you. And so he contrasts this with a true desire, right? True needs, things that you really want, right? And what do people really want? They want freedom, right? They want to be able to choose their life. They want to be able to create their own selves. They want to be truly free. And so what capitalism offers up is a false freedom. And what Marcuse is saying is that what we really need is a true liberty. Right? And how do we do that? By refusing, right? He calls this the great refusal or ultimate refusal, refusing to get involved in this consumer society, rejecting it, right? And again, it's this idea of criticizing the current society, waking people up, allowing them to imagine a different world, a world that is not one-dimensional, a world that is multi-dimensional. Okay, we're on to the last part. So the last person is Jurgen Habermas. And so Habermas is also a critical theorist, but he's obviously, in a way, he's less radical than the early critical theorists. He's less of a Marxist. He still is in kind of very left-leaning, but he's less of a kind of a ardent Marxist. And his main critique really is this idea of rationalization. Right? This is what his main criticism or critical aspect is. And so he's kind of not just taking this from Marx, but also taking it from Weber, right, who has criticized rationality. And so what he's saying is that part of the problem of modern society is that it's become too rational, right? So too efficient, too organized, too kind of focused on doing things as efficiently as possible, right? And so he's really saying that this way of doing things, this kind of focus on efficiency, this focus on rationality, has really kind of diverted our attention to what we really want or what we need, right? And so in this reading, he's not the clearest writer, but he's really trying to get us to think about the rationality, what he calls technical rationality. So the use of computers, the use of evaluation forms, the use of surveys to judge opinion. They're saying all this might be a little bit too rational, and it's again making people a bit too passive. And so what he's trying to say is, how can we have a world, how can we have a science that understands people's real existence, what he calls the life world. So this is, in essence, an overview of critical theory. right? It's very much, the very different approach than structural functionalism, right? It says, again, to summarize, that the goal of social thought is not simply to describe objectively the way society is, but to criticize the current structure of society and to offer people a vision of a different society, one that could be better.